name's John Coyne. I'm the head of the Border Security Program here at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. And today we have with us Dr. Leah Farrell from the Australian National University's National Security College. Leah is one of Australia's leading experts, if not the globe's leading experts, on counter-terrorism in regards to online environment, with a specific focus on how terrorist groups use cyber. Welcome, Leah.
Thank you, John.
Leah, I know over the last sort of 10 or so years you've been collecting a whole range of online data, which is sort of, for us academics and also think tanks we're incredibly jealous of. I was wondering if you want to take a few moments to describe what you've been up to over the last sort of 10 years with online data.
John, I've had a long-standing interest in how extremist groups use the internet from an operational capacity through to propaganda dissemination. And so basically I've just been sitting, reading and collecting information. Started as a hobby, it's obviously expanded a little bit more, but my primary interest is in making sure that we properly understand how the internet's being used, who's using it, and what the impacts are. So I've collected a range of data. I focus on things like building lexicons of terminology because I'm fascinated, for example, by the uptake of different slang in different militant milieus, all the way through to how the internet's been used as a substitute for command and control with various groups. So the data I have ranges obviously from magazines and videos all the way through to tracking people's use of different social media, how aliases are used. And for me, it's one of the areas that's been an enduring fascination.
Over the last sort of year or so, even up to say 2 years, we've had a whole heap of conversations in the policy environment, academic environment, with this buzzword, which is CVE, our acronym, counter-violent extremism and online radicalisation. Given your research, I was wondering if you could sort of provide us with a brief summary of really what this online environment is like now.
Well, I think we need to think of the online environment in the extremist sense as being a virtual community, but it's a very exclusive virtual community. There's obviously a clear in and out group. And I like to think of this in the terms of policing as well. I know Andrew Colvin spoke about, learning to police virtual communities where what you perceive as your group or your neighbours can be online as well as the physical sense. And for these extremist groups, their online universe is very tight and it doesn't comprise of anybody else apart from who they support, even though they might exist essentially in a broader pool of people. So I've been looking at how they essentially construct their boundaries and their sense of in and out, because that goes right to this notion of countering violent extremism, because I think that the danger with some programs is that you can even push people further into these online refuges, for want of a better word, because there's the sense that they're being pigeonholed or targeted. So, I have some concerns about the language that we're using in our attempts to make sure the youth in our country are resilient. I think we need to be focusing far more on resilience rather than countering extremism, essentially walking up to a group of young people. We think you're vulnerable to this ideology. You've got a background in criminology and areas like that. You would know doing that in any forum with any young people in deprived areas can be very counterproductive. Yep. And I think we need to bring that clinical sense that we take from policing through into countering violent extremism a little more.
Yep. Just so the people watching this and listening can sort of get a feel for it. Over the last 12 months, so how does a young person, without creating, of course, a how-to guide, so how does a young person go from being a dissatisfied young person to getting into these closed inner circle groups? Is it that easy?
It can be that easy. I did one experiment, the start of some of the data that you'd seen last year. I thought, I'm going to just put my hat on, pretend I'm someone that's randomly searching words into Google. Of course, I do have some insight into what words are popular. It took me 20 minutes to find an active account of someone on the ground over there involved with the Islamic State. Now, we've seen, obviously the constriction of that group, and a lot of things happen in the time since I did that. But it was fascinating to me. Now, again, I knew what I was looking for, but I think that we could make, the case that anybody who was interested could do it in a very short period of time.
Yep.
Could find someone to talk to. Now, finding someone to talk to and engaging are two different things. But backing up to why people look in this area and how they do it, I think, we need to be looking at what takes place along the lines of resilience. So people are feeling unempowered or disempowered, or there's something happening that causes them to seek out that behaviour. But a lot of it is actually group initiated too. We know from earlier investigations that one friend tends to radicalise another. People tend to view videos together. People engage in social media together. You always see teenagers standing
Yep.
around with their phones. That type of behaviour is normal, and it's also that type of behaviour that you see in these groups as well. So we have to be careful assuming that it's an isolated behaviour, but we then can have people who are very isolated who seek out. So the main message there is that there's a real danger in assuming we've got to counter online extremism and assuming there's one pathway.
Yep.
There are many, which is why understanding the language and the key themes that resonate is so crucial to understanding how those different pathways work, being able to map them and essentially being able to look at places where you can make young people who are at risk of essentially hitting that point where they stop seeking and they start being groomed, and making them more resilient to that grooming activity.
Look, we've talked a lot in the past, about how unhelpful it is about push and pull theories, or are people pulled into terrorism, organised crime, or a market's pushed, or so. I mean, with you're saying now is, and this is something we've both discussed in the past, that really the name of the game here is actually touching on complexity and engaging with it.
It is absolutely. I mean, there is no point trying to say there is a continuum, there is an elevator theory of radicalisation. Because each person is different. But what is common is the language.
Yep.
There is a doctrinal aspect to this. Groups are selling a vision and using the same language over and over. What is different is how people identify. What resonates for one person may not resonate for another. And I like the complexity aspect to this, in the sense that you do need to be able to operate with all of these different pathways and acceptance that these different pathways exist. One way I've looked at it is looking at conversion theory. If we consider the Islamic State as a deviant sect of Islam, for example, we can apply religious conversion theory, which identifies parts of a process, but acknowledges in the way they do it that it is not linear, and that there can be backtracking, which you would know from your background in criminal activity or in counter-terrorism. People don't necessarily just zoom from A to B. They have doubts, they backtrack, they change, they engage their friends, they fall out with their friends, they fight one another. And so I think there are many ways that we can be looking at these phenomena, particularly in the online space, and we're just not engaging the full range of tools. I think we're being seduced by the lull of a simplistic solution.
Yep. As a think tank, and this is always the difficult thing, we love, academics and think tankers, we love to sit in a room, we've got the luxury of talking theory and ideas. Okay, now there's this magic moment about applied policy. And I know that you've talked in particular about young women, and there's been a lot of talk about young women being radicalised online at the moment. I was wondering, from the very applied policy perspective, if you'd like to talk us through some ideas you have about some measures or some countermeasures or plannings or strategy that we can do, and by that, Australia and more broadly, around this problem and challenge.
Well, I think we should be stepping back from CVE and looking in the first instance at the behaviour. We have young women online being radicalised. Now, whether they're seeking or whether they're being groomed, let's set this aside for a start, because the first thing I've seen that I don't see in the literature anywhere is most young women that I see that are posting radical sentiments online from Australia are posting at 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. Now, these are 16 or 17-year-olds that are also talking about going to school or having a fight with their parents. And so my first thoughts are, well, we need to be educating parents exactly the same way we do educate parents about protecting their children from child sexual predators. And so I think that the best way to do that is to remove it from the CVE space, broaden the scope of perhaps something with the e-safety commissioner if it's online, or what they do in terms of protecting children, and really focus on making sure that parents are aware of this issue. And then you're not stigmatising a community either.
Yep.
And you're making sure that valuable information can get out into the mainstream, because there are probably a lot of teenagers that are online because their parents don't know what sites they're on. They don't know perhaps how to restrict their teenagers from being online. You can make them put their phones outside at a certain time while they're doing their study. You can restrict things through the router. Making sure parents understand that, I think, is a crucial first step, because without that access, the ways in which people can radicalise are significantly restricted.
Look, I've had a look before at the I Think You Know campaign, which is the long-running campaign done between the private sector and the Australian Federal Police.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting because it's targeted at stopping child exploitation, but it's targeted both educating the parents and educating the children. So you have this sort of dual thing done through schools. And I was wondering, do you think it would work in the same way for radicalisation?
I think we just need to broaden that, because that's a great campaign, but you don't see it, for example, in high publication daily newspapers. You don't see ads on television as much as what you should. You don't hear ads on radio. So those types of programs, it's great to send it out to social media, but the parents that are on social media probably already know how to better control their children's social media habits, or at least have an understanding of it. So we need to be thinking about, how are we going to get to audiences that we haven't gotten to? And then there are translation issues as well for some communities, or there's just the issue of accessibility. I mean, older generations may not even know what this technology is. So I think that there's an entire range of activities we can be doing there outside of the CVE space that's empowering parents to protect their children. Because this is what it's about at the base level. We have children that are vulnerable and that, need to be supported, and the best way to do that obviously is in the home.
Now, Leo, I understand that look, a lot of Islamic groups here in Australia, and I always say that because there's more than one Islamic group in Australia or Islamic community in Australia, a lot of them feel, and a lot of dissatisfied youth feel this way, that as soon as policies come out that are targeted against just their community, it's seen as it's unintended consequences. All the best meaning in the world is seen as something that's actually targeting them as opposed to working with them. And I was wondering, how do you think we go about that? Like, how do we make that message less about we're targeting, this problem with Islam or Muslim radicalisation, and this is actually about child safety?
Well, I think one thing that always trips up these programs is that they're formulated by a lot of people that haven't actually had an experience of being in communities or witnessing radicalisation, or children being vulnerable, and so there's a lack of appreciation of the fact that this is a commitment over years. People come in and sell these fantastic, enrol people in de-radicalisation programs. The most effective thing we know from crime more generally is engagement. Social workers, community resilience, police, citizens, youth clubs, all of those things that we've done more broadly need to be reconsidered, because they don't need to be under the flag of CVE, and they assist marginalised and vulnerable communities no matter what. And I think that's the way we need to be thinking about this, because what we do know about people that become vulnerable to extremist messaging is that they feel disempowered. They don't feel listened to. And as we all know, the pathway to extremism is one that's people proselytise. They try and recruit their friends. They talk at their friends because they're feeling more empowered by doing that. So it has to be an engagement over the long term. You have to have more social workers involved, because realistically, when we're talking about youth resilience, they are at the front line. They've always been at the front line, and they've probably got far more tips on how to deal with an alienated, angry young person than any of us sitting in Canberra or in a think tank or a university do have.
Look, and I know that you spent a lot of time in Egypt, and you've spent a lot of time looking at this issue of online radicalisation and terrorism use of the internet. How does it compare? So how do we compare with young being radicalised online in, say, Egypt and here in Australia? Is there a difference?
Most people in Egypt, I think, if we look at what's happening, say, for example, with the Islamic State, there were two types of people that were radicalised there. There's the elite that might be involved in social media and active on the internet, and then there's people radicalised through social groups, and people actually went to fight for the Islamic State because they received money, and there was a financial element. So you raise a really important point. We've got to be mindful that for different countries and different places, there are very different pathways, very different sets of grievances or vulnerabilities that can lead to people being vulnerable to extremist messaging. And I think that was one of the big takeaways for me, is just how complex it is, but also how the one thing, again, that everyone relates to is the doctrine.
Yep.
But it's different parts for different places. We know, for example, some people are vulnerable to being recruited when they're foreign students because they feel alienated. Other people are vulnerable in their home country. So how they identify with that doctrine, and unfortunately, a lot of folks, it's too hard to engage with that doctrine, and it is quite contentious to be able to have those discussions. But again, the talking process of disengaging young people involves these issues, and you don't have to be a religious expert. You just have to be someone willing to engage in conversation. I mean, I've had access to a remarkable array of people. I'm not a religious scholar. I don't have that background, but I'm willing to sit and talk and listen and engage, and that is what this is all about.
Right. Okay, so having lived in Egypt, having been here in Australia, having been with the AFP, having done a ton of investigative type work, and indeed having done stuff in Indonesia, how does a parent go about, in a practical sense? Like, what if there were three pieces of advice that you could give communities or community leaders and or parents right now, what would they be?
I think the first one would be to pay very close attention to what your child's doing on social media. That doesn't mean spy on them, but just be aware of their usage patterns, be aware of what they're doing, and be engaged with that. None of us like to see our kids, in a room all night playing on social media anyway. I mean, there's a scholastic element there that we need to be dealing with, and every family deals with that differently. I'm certainly not implying parents should spy on their children, but that type of awareness that we see with protecting our children from other negative behaviours on the internet, I think we need to expand out. Another thing too is just to be mindful of changes in social network, changes in behaviour, and to be aware that one of the most consistent things in terrorist recruitment and grooming activity is to attempt to disassociate young people from their family. And even when we look at the biographies of young people who have gone and joined Al-Qaeda or gone and joined Islamic State, they always say separating from their family was the hardest thing. And when you're looking, and when I'm looking at these profiles of young women, over and over again, it's clashes between mum and grandma and these young girls about whether to wear the hijab or whether you can wax your eyebrows, because in some extremist narratives that's considered forbidden. So, parents being aware that this is what their children are being fed online, and being able to see that happening and to perhaps engage their children in some conversations, I think is critically important. And that comes back to an issue of, which is difficult for all parents, of internet literacy. It also comes back to what communities know, what law enforcement knows. Do we know the slang that young people are being spoken to about this? Do we know the derisive terms that are being used to describe parents or community members? And I always make a joke that there should be a charlatan CVE checklist, because if the people who are formulating these policies aren't up to date with the language that's being used to essentially, corner these young people and target them with this messaging, I don't think we've got a hope of being able to prevent them. And the most important thing then, to return it to what parents can do, is to try and be literate of this information. Then we've got a big problem, because people in the community are probably rightfully scared of jumping on the internet and searching for this stuff. So I think that's where think tanks and academia can play a really important role in getting out there and engaging with the community and saying, this is the type of material that's out there. Are you aware of it? Can we help you? What do you need to know? We don't have all the answers, but there is that difficulty here with the highly politicised nature of the subject matter, and then the fear of, well, what can happen if I search this? Can I get in trouble? So there needs to be some debates and discussions, which is why I think putting it in the child safety side of things rather than CVE might make people more comfortable to come and sit at a round table and have these discussions, and at the very least, build awareness they need to protect their children.
I wonder if you care to comment though. Look, there's a certain element of all this where it's about curiosity. Like young women and women are all the same, in the sense of we're all curious about things. So don't touch that from the very early age, and the first thing they do is touch it. And this constant message, this is bad. So, where does curiosity fit in all of this? And how do we discriminate between where some young person's being curious and engaging?
This is where I think the amplification effect of social media has really come into its own, because the curiosity, back when I was looking in the mid-2000s, curiosity, you'd Google, but you had a few steps to get to an internet forum, and then you had to register, and some of them were closed, and you had to know someone, or you could just sit and read the material. But the process of searching to get to it involved a few more steps, whereas now, with Twitter, with Facebook, it's a little bit more of a fire hose effect. You still have to seek it out. You can sit on Twitter and you're not going to see Islamic State or Al Qaeda propaganda unless you're looking for it. But I suppose the speed bumps along the way weren't there or aren't there anymore. So I think from that perspective, we've got to have a think about what we can do to be aware of the changes to what's happening in terms of usage patterns. And again, getting back to if parents know that it's, if you know your child touching a PowerPoint is harmful, parents don't know necessarily what sites provide fast access to this material. You might think it's perfectly fine that your child's using a messaging platform because you might think that platform's just used to arrange to go and meet friends at a shopping centre, without knowing that that's the same platform where all of the newsletters from extremist groups are released. So I think that type of thing is good to let the community know. And, there's the counter to that is always, well, extremists will find out and then they'll change. Well, that will happen anyway. And I think we're at that point where we've got such an amplification of social media that the best way forward is to let parents protect their children rather than to sit there and go, well, if we tell everybody, then they'll just change. Because at the end of the day, these groups rely on being able to get this doctrine out there and sell it. And there are only a certain number of ways they can do that. So they have to be out in the open. We can always find them again. Our focus should be on helping parents know, I think.
So you sort of think it's irrelevant, that question that gets asked all the time we see in the newspapers, are we winning the social media war against IS? Is that, from your perspective, helpful, unhelpful?
I'm of the view that I don't think we will ever win it. I think it's a little bit like whack-a-mole. I think social media companies can do it a lot better in terms of how they are going about assisting in this area. But that is a much bigger issue about privacy and freedoms and intelligence agencies. And so I think what we need to be doing is bite-sized chunks, because that's a huge issue. What we can manage is making people more aware. And we can do that in the least politicised way that we can think of, which is child safety. You may not be able to stop using that approach, a 21-year-old jumping on social media, but nothing is really going to stop that 21-year-old. And that's where we need to understand that there is a certain seeking element in this. I do often see vulnerable young people being groomed. And young women are a prime example. We can be very dramatic when we're young, and these girls, it's amazing the amount of them that have an unrequited crush, or who have had a relationship breakup, or who are having typical teenage problems, but who are expressing that online and on the margins of these extremist narratives who just find that sympathetic ear.
Yep.
And again, you know, simple things like if that sympathetic ear is at 1 o'clock in the morning and you're awake at 1 o'clock in the morning and that's the person you talk to the most, we know from a range of other studies into marketing and everything, you will identify. You will pull away from your physical community into that network. So these simple, you know, bite-sized chunks, rather than going, oh, you know, we've got to stop the accounts, we've got to do all of these things. I think, you know, there are probably policy people that need to be doing that, but let's focus on what we can do quite quickly and quite effectively in terms of putting some type of barrier between children's ability to do this without it being known.
Look, Leah, thank you very much on behalf of ASPI and on behalf of our audience today. Look, I take some really key points, and it's hard to summarise up after we spent such a long time together. But I take some really key points from this, which is, you know, as we've talked about in the past, this issue of complexity and, you know, getting in and dealing with the complexity, the issue of not making this an Islamic issue, making this a child protection issue. I especially love this, the whole concept of making it about a family issue and about discussions with families, about looking after their family and their children, etc. And the last bit, which is sometimes, you know, we do have a habit in the policy world of trying to find these magic bullets, these magic solutions across the board to solve really complex problems. I especially take your point today about the fact that, you know, we've got to start, and we can start by making a difference in these small pockets. And it may be some time, and may indeed be a long time before we can say that, you know, that problem's completely gone. So look, once again, thank you very much today, Leah, and I look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thank you, John.